All right, looking at the matter of excellence over mediocrity. The word mediocrity or mediocre means halfway up the mountain. It's an old word, M-E-D-I, medi, meaning to the middle or in the middle, and then Ocris, O-C-R-I-S, is a cliff or a ledge, a hill or a mountain. And so the word mediocrity means halfway up the mountain. And so now, of course, now we understand that it's basically, it's average at best and lazy at worst. Average at best and lazy at worst. Kind of like the guy that was going to swim across the English Channel. He swam halfway across and decided he couldn't make it, so he turned around and swam back. That didn't really happen, Kathy. I just made that up. That's right. Yeah, that's right. But anyway, looking at Philippians 1, 9, and 10, Paul makes this statement to the Philippians. He says, "And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ." Y'all know I love the word discernment because it's so important. It's always been important. And in our day and time, it is especially important to be discerning. Just in so many areas of our lives, and I just mean humanity in general. In so many aspects of our lives, there's just this lack of discernment. There's a lack of concern as to whether or not what I read or hear is true. And especially it gets worse and worse when you start talking about with social media and things of that nature. But the Bible tells us we are to be discerning. Then you have, for example, in Hebrews 5 in verse 12, says that meat belongs to those who are of full age, who have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. And so the ability of discernment, or the gift or the characteristic of discernment, is vitally important. A lack of discernment leads to so much religious error. I mean, for example, if you just look at all these people that claim they can perform miracles. Anybody with an ounce of discernment, just an ounce of discernment, can see that is not so. And an ounce of discernment to compare what is claimed against what we can read clearly in the Bible is enough to show us that such is patently false. How many people have been cured of COVID by miraculous? How many? There's a whole ton of people in this county that believe in miracles. When's the last time they had a big announcement and laid hands on people and cured them of the COVID? Much less cancer or heart disease or some addiction or whatever. And so again, just a little bit of discernment goes a long way in helping safeguard us from being led astray.
What gets me is, I was reading this farm magazine. It had a little incubator there and said you hatch these chickens, see the miracle of birth. That's not a miracle.
Not a miracle.
I don't understand people talking about miracles.
Well,
really, I don't.
They've taken a perfectly good word and illegitimized it, for lack of a better term, and made it mean what it never was intended to mean. All right, now look in the second paragraph under the excellence section. I love the reference here because I love this song. The song "Rise Up, O Men of God." It's a great song. It's what we call an old religious anthem. And the word about, it's uninspired, and yet the words of the song cited in this particular case are so apropos. Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and soul and mind and strength to serve the King of Kings. Lesser things. In other words, rid yourself of lesser things. Paul said to Timothy, no man who is enlisted as a soldier entangles himself with the affairs of this life that he might please him who has called him to be a soldier. In other words, a soldier has to be single-minded. He can't be distracted by what's going on at home or what's going on somewhere else. He needs to be focused and single-minded to the task at hand. In other words, he does not entangle himself in the affairs of this life, which I suspect is one reason why, I can't prove this, but I would suspect that it's true, that when they first instituted the draft in the Vietnam War, only single men were drafted. Married men, were accepted, and then married men with children were accepted. In other words, what were they doing? Well, they were trying to get the most single-minded individuals, people that wouldn't be minded of things in other places. And so with that in mind, we see that we are to be of a similar mind with regard to our religious service. Have done with lesser things. Be discerning. It's not always a matter of choosing good over evil. Many times it's a matter of choosing better over good, or good over neutral. And so again, that's the only way to find excellence, is to be discerning and figure out what indeed is excellent. And then the last paragraph says, in essence what I said, some lesser things are not necessarily sinful, but the unwillingness to give up some of those things is keeping God's people from being as useful and as impactful as He would like for them to be. Thorny soil, parable of the sower. What was the problem with the thorny soil? It wasn't that they lacked ability. It wasn't that they lacked opportunity. It wasn't that they lacked depth of earth or water or anything else. Well, what happened? Well, they allowed the affairs of this life to enter into, their scope of existence, and it crowded out all the good things, and then they didn't bear any fruit. All the other things, the wayside soil had the birds, and the stony soil had, really had no earth. But the thorny soil could have been good soil if it had been willing to be done with lesser things. And so you have that there at the bottom of page 28. Top of page 29. Good people with enormous potential often fail to do great things, not because they lack the ability, but because they have settled for good enough when something much better is possible. And that's a trout that starts young. Good enough. Good enough. All bees might be good, right? But sometimes all bees might not be so good. When A's are possible, B's are not good enough. And so we can fall into the trap of good enough. I just want to stay on the honor roll of the president's list, or in my case early on, I just want to stay off of academic probation. Whatever's good enough to keep me off academic probation was. And by the way, before I got done, I was on the president's list four semesters in a row, which is like 3.4 or better. And so, I went from academic probation to the president's list. All right, and so, but a lot of things changed in my life. Like one, I got married, and that changed your perspective on a lot of things, especially when you're in school. But good enough is not good enough. I can remember one time working for a guy, and we had a government contract to paint duplexes up in Missouri. And there were some guys working with us that had the good enough attitude. There's an old saying, it's what? It's good enough or close enough for what? Thank you, Lynn. Government work. That's exactly right. It's good enough or close enough for government work. And those guys had that attitude. And by the way, the buildings that they painted showed that. You know, I wasn't raised that way. You know, that wasn't good enough. You know, I wanted to look, and I was never going to see anybody that lived in those buildings. I was never going to meet any of them. I was never going to see anybody because I didn't even live. I lived 100 miles from that town. But good enough wasn't good enough. But it was for some. And of course, Lynn sees that kind of stuff all the time in the construction business. You know, good enough or close enough for government work. But that's just not a way to get through life. Think about how many young people there are who could have accomplished great things with their lives, but they were always satisfied with good enough. It's interesting to me that my son was one of them that wanted to be just good enough. And now he's a school teacher and a basketball coach. And guess what? Good enough ain't good enough anymore. And he realizes that. You know, he wants his students to excel. And he wants his basketball players to excel. And it doesn't matter if you're the best player on the team. If you can play at 80% and be the best player on the team, that's still not good enough. You got to give it all. And so it's just interesting to see, you know, and obviously Shelby was the opposite of that. It was never good enough, you know. Everything just always had to be perfect for her. And so I raised a black and white, you know, positive, negative, whatever opposite you want to have. I had one of each. And by the way, both of them will give you a lot of grief. Both of them give you a lot of grief, just different kinds. All right, but God wants us to give our very, very best. Jeremiah 29:13 says, "You will seek me and find me when you search for me with your whole heart." Your whole heart. You know, God is not going to be satisfied with half-hearted service, half-hearted effort. And so there's a kind of a personal anecdote, but I'm not going to read that. You can read that on your own if you want. I want to get on over into chapter 3, get this thing started while we're going this week. Now this account on page 31 begins with an anecdote, and this really hit home for me because when we left and went to Arizona in 91, we worked primarily with young people from junior high through campus. I had a campus ministry. And then when I left Arizona and went to Paris, Tennessee, again, I worked with young people. And I worked with young people in Arizona, many of whom were not raised in religious households. Then I came to Tennessee and I worked with 100 kids who were all, in essence, being raised in religious households. And it was interesting when I read this to think about that the kids who obeyed the gospel after they left their home and went to college were far more diligent in their service to God than the kids who had been raised all their lives in Christian homes. I mean, I had a group of boys from Embry-Riddle University, and I'm talking about Embry-Riddle is an aeronautical and engineering university, aerospace engineering. You got to be really, really smart to get into Embry-Riddle. I mean, these guys were super intelligent. And almost every single one of them had obeyed the gospel because somebody else at Embry-Riddle, one of their classmates, had converted them. He had since graduated when I moved in. But these guys were so diligent to study the Bible. They wanted, they desired to study and do and grow and prosper. And then you go to the Bible Belt in Paris, Tennessee. And by the way, what I found in a lot of cases with a lot of the young people was simply just an extension of what their parents were. Their parents had been raised in the church, but they weren't super active. They weren't super committed, so therefore they had. Now look, you could count on them to be there about every time, but the whole attitude was different, and so this anecdote struck me because he talked about one of the kids at a youth function who had made a confession at this function, and it said, here's what he wrote. It says, "You name it, I've done it. You name it, I've done it." And then he says, immediately I started thinking of things and couldn't help wondering, did he really do this or that or some other ungodly thing? He was a deacon's son, grown up in a family of Christians, devout in the practice of their faith. How was it possible for this young man who had such an outstanding heritage of faith to become entangled in so many sinful things? Why wasn't he making better decisions? And then the answer, here's the answer at the bottom. The gap between what Christians know and what they do is not just a youth-oriented problem. It is a challenge for every Christian, regardless of age or maturity. In other words, just because we know better doesn't mean we do better. Just because we know better doesn't mean we do better. I've been working with House to House. Well, last month marked 19 years. I've worked with House to House, Heart to Heart for 19 years. 17 of those years have been involved in answering Bible questions that come through the House to House website. I cannot tell you how many questions or just people wanting to talk via the keyboard. My husband is an elder in the Lord's church, and he has spent more than $25,000 in the last 3 years on pornography. And by the way, that is scarcely an isolated incident. Scarcely an isolated incident. Preachers, elders, deacons, what would you say, average pew member husbands, whatever, in the church. Pornography problems. Drug problems. Deacon went in for a surgery and they couldn't put him out for his surgery. And that's when they discovered he had a drug problem, because the drugs they were using to try to anesthetize him to have surgery weren't working. It kind of reminds me of the old statement, be sure your sin will find you out. Why aren't these things working? Well, he had to fess up. Got a drug problem. Preachers, closet alcoholics. The number of preachers that are closet alcoholics will shock you. That drink themselves to sleep at night. I'm not saying they're out there by the thousands or the tens of thousands. I'm just saying in 17 years of doing what I've done, I've seen it way yonder more than anybody would expect. Spousal abuse. Preachers, elders, deacons. All of those things. All those things. Again, and this is not even mentioning the various things that you would think about, like infidelities and things of that nature. But in every single case, do we not understand that they knew better? Of course they did. Of course they knew better. Now, if this kind of thing happens among preachers, elders, and deacons, you reckon it happens among just regular old members too? Now, do they know better? Do they know better? I'll give you an example. There's a guy held a gospel meeting here one time, and if you look in that church library, you can probably find a cassette tapes of that meeting, and in that meeting, he preached on the subject of fornication. And all the while he was holding that meeting, he was having an affair with his secretary and left his wife and married her. Moved out west and still claims to be a gospel preacher. Still claims to be a gospel preacher. Listen, folks, what we know and what we do don't always don't always add up. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how old we are. It doesn't matter how old we are. In fact, when you get to be as old as I am, and just about all of you, just about any time we do wrong, we know better, don't we? In other words, the ignorance of youth only goes so far. And as I scan this audience, there's only one person in here that might claim ignorance of youth, and that's Miss Beulah. Actually, I was thinking about Graceland. But here's the thing. The rest of us know better. And I'm not saying that we're guilty of any of the things that I've talked about. I'm just saying when we do wrong, but we know better. And so that's such a poignant statement, and it's so practical. And he just lists here, preachers, deacons, elders wrestle with sinful habits that have to do with conduct or character. I'll give you another example. I know of at least three different cases where preachers had to be dismissed because they didn't pay their bills in town. And then the church, or members of the church, had to go through town and settle all those debts so that the new preacher wouldn't be behind the 8 ball in the community. By the way, and one I'm not even wasn't thinking about, Flavel Nichols said that he went into a town and took a work and found that all of the, went around and introduced himself in all the local places, and found all the business people to be very cold toward him. And he didn't know why. They didn't know him. Come to find out, the guy that had been there before him had left bad debts all over town. When he found that out, he met with the elders. He said, "Brethren," he said, "whatever it takes, we got to go settle every one of those debts." And he said, and the minute the church resolved and paid all those debts and cleared those accounts, he said, the whole world opened up to him in that town. But he started off behind the 8 ball because the guy that was there before him wouldn't pay his debts. Now, does the guy not know better than that? Well, sure he does. And so many of these things. And by the way, almost all the things that I've mentioned tonight fall under the primary heading there on page 32 of pursuing personal desires. Pursuing personal desires. It says it is possible to know a lot about the Bible without allowing that knowledge to have any measurable impact on the way we live or the decisions that we make. Countless people wear the name of Jesus, but not all of them follow his example or obey the moral teaching. Many are governed by much less demanding standards, which is always convenient. Instead of following God's word, some Christians make decisions based on their personal desires. And so with that, we'll just introduce that. It's about 7 o'clock. They're going to turn the kids loose on us here in just a moment. So, didn't bring a pen, but we'll start right there. Lord willing, next Wednesday night. Well, not next Wednesday night. That'd be tomorrow. No, tomorrow's this Wednesday night. Y'all know what I mean. What day? Will that be is that the December the 2nd? Okay. It's 12/2/20. We'll start right there on pursuing personal desires.